What if I told you the strangest casseroles ever baked in American kitchens weren't born out of luxury, but desperation? In a time when meat was rationed, milk was scarce, and sugar was nearly forbidden, American homemakers didn't give up. They got creative, and sometimes that creativity went a little too far. From upside-down tomato soup pies to banana peels turned into bacon, even coffee ground casseroles and prune whip pies. These weren't just meals. They were survival blueprints from America's toughest days. And today, we're opening the old cookbooks they try to forget to uncover 10 of the most bizarre, haunting, and shockingly real casseroles in American history. If you love stories they don't teach in school, if forgotten food, wartime secrets, and kitchen courage fascinate you, then hit that subscribe button, like this video, to keep the memories alive. Comment with your favorite weird dish, and share this with someone who needs to see how far creativity can stretch in the face of hardship. This isn't your grandmother's casserole collection. This is food history they never meant to repeat. So grab a seat at the table and prepare to be amazed. Tomato soup, a pantry staple. But in the 1940s, it became something more, a survival ingredient. This casserole wasn't about flavor. It was about filling bellies when there was nothing left to cook. The base: white bread cubes, soaked in reconstituted evaporated milk. Then came the tomato soup, straight from the can, undiluted, poured thick like sauce. But here's where it gets strange. Cooks would flip it. They'd layer sliced onions, grated carrots, and even chopped canned green beans on the bottom. Then pour the soup-soaked bread mixture on top and bake it upside down. Once out of the oven, they'd invert it onto a serving plate, revealing a steaming, jelly-like dome of vegetables trapped beneath a tangy bread pudding crust. It looked like meatloaf. It wasn't. This was the illusion of dinner, the memory of a Sunday roast made entirely from scraps. And yet, people were grateful. They lit candles. They said grace. Because in homes where hunger was a daily visitor, this strange creation meant one more night together. These days, you won't find it in any glossy cookbook. But once this dish fed hope, one upside-down spoonful at a time. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, bakers faced a brutal reality. No eggs, no butter, no milk. But they still craved comfort, something sweet to chase the bitterness of the times. Enter the tomato soup cake casserole, a recipe born out of pure necessity and sheer culinary madness. It started with a can of condensed tomato soup, not for flavor but for moisture. Flour, sugar, baking soda, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove came next. No frosting, no fancy layers, just a thick, ruddy red batter poured into a casserole dish and baked until the house smelled less like poverty and more like memory. And yet the taste? Some swore it was just like spice cake, rich, comforting, a little mysterious. Others? They couldn't get past the tangy aftertaste, the whisper of ketchup in every bite. But in homes where birthdays had no candles, this cake was enough. It meant someone cared enough to try. Today, this bizarre dish exists only in whispers, faded ink in wartime cookbooks, and the memories of those who were just grateful to have cake at all. And if this made you raise an eyebrow, just wait till you hear what they did with prunes, peanut butter, and calf brains. Stick around. And if you're as shocked as we are, drop a comment and tell us. Would you take a bite? Water pie. 2 words that sound like a cruel joke. But for many Depression-era families, it was the only dessert on the table. Now imagine stretching 1 cup of flour and a pitcher of plain water into a whole casserole-style pie. No eggs, no milk, no fruit, just sugar, a little lard or butter if you were lucky, and a sprinkle of vanilla if someone still had some left. They'd pour water straight into a raw pie crust, no thickening first. Then scatter sugar and flour over the top, it with whatever fat they had, and bake it until it magically turned gelatinous. The result? A glistening, barely set, translucent pie that wobbled like custard, but tasted like survival. Mothers served it warm in bowls like pudding or sliced like a soft tart. Kids called it miracle pie, but it wasn't a miracle. It was a sacrifice, a way to turn nothing into something. In kitchens where food stamps were gold and ovens ran on hope, water pie reminded families that even the humblest ingredients could still create moments of sweetness. This casserole was never meant to be remembered, but here we are telling its story. Because history isn't just written in textbooks, it's baked into strange little dishes like this. And if you've made it this far, you're one of us. Don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next will leave you speechless. Vinegar. Not exactly the first ingredient that comes to mind when you think of pie. But during the Great Depression, when lemons were a luxury and fresh fruit was a fading memory, vinegar became an unlikely hero. This wasn't just a pie. This was a casserole-style invention, baked in large batches, often in cast-iron pans, and cut into squares for the whole family. Flour, sugar, water, and then a splash of apple cider vinegar, sharp, acidic, meant to trick the tongue into tasting lemon. It was called poor man's lemon pie, and for good reason. The filling had no eggs, no citrus, no zest, just thickened water with a tangy bite. Mothers added a pinch of nutmeg or cinnamon to soften the edge. Sometimes a knob of margarine floated on top. It wasn't elegant, it was enough. Imagine sitting at a chipped table, your father silent after a long day of job hunting, your mother cutting clean squares from this glossy, golden brown slab. The crust flaky but stretched thin, the filling trembling between sweet and sour. No one said it was delicious, but everyone cleaned their plate. In some homes, this casserole-style pie was served at birthdays. Not because it was a favorite, but because it was all they could manage. And over time, people began to love it. Not for the flavor, but for what it represented: ingenuity, dignity, and the stubborn belief that desserts still belonged at the table. Today, recipes for vinegar pie survive only in dusty community cookbooks and fading memories. Yet the taste, once strange, now carries the flavor of survival. If you've ever tasted hardship or resilience, this dish is your story too. Hit that like button and let us know. Would you serve vinegar in a pie? No eggs, no milk, no butter. What kind of casserole could possibly come from that? The answer: one of the most remarkable and forgotten creations of the Depression era. A dish born not from abundance, but from the sheer will to make do. During the 1930s, a trip to the pantry often revealed nothing but flour, shortening, and maybe a spoonful of molasses. Fresh dairy? Unthinkable. But families still needed to eat, especially the children. So home cooks adapted. They mixed flour and water into a dough, added a little baking soda for rise, and just a spoonful of sugar or molasses for flavor. Some folded in canned corn or leftover mashed beans for body. The whole thing was pressed into a greased casserole dish, topped with whatever scraps they had, maybe chopped onions, a drizzle of oil, or if they were lucky, a dusting of herb from the backyard. It was bland, it was dry, but it was warm, and that warmth was everything. They called it the three-less casserole, or sometimes just the nothing bake. It became a symbol of wartime thrift and domestic courage. A dish passed around church basements, neighborhood potlucks, and factory lunchrooms, not because it was delicious, but because it was possible. There was pride in serving it. Mothers didn't apologize. They served it hot, they served it grateful, and they served it knowing that resilience was sometimes the only real ingredient on hand. Today, recipes for this humble casserole are nearly extinct, overshadowed by fancier meals and modern convenience. But its story deserves a seat at the table. So tell us, could you make a meal without eggs, milk, or butter. If this stirred something inside you, subscribe, because these stories won't survive unless we tell them. In the darkest corners of American history, some of the most bizarre dishes became family favorites. Not because they were delicious, but because they were possible. Enter the ketchup and cornflake meatloaf casserole, the dinner no one asked for, but many came to love. Meat was rationed during wartime. A full pound of beef? Rare. So home cooks got clever. They stretched what little ground meat they had with torn bread, oatmeal, or more commonly, crushed cornflakes. And ketchup? That bright red bottle became the Depression era's most cherished flavoring. Tomato paste was scarce. Spices were expensive. But ketchup? It was sweet, tangy, vinegary, and it covered a multitude of sins. Mothers would mix their meager meat blend with eggs, if available, cornflakes, onions, salt, pepper, and a generous squirt of ketchup, both in the mix and smeared on top. The result was baked in a loaf pan or pressed into a casserole dish, then sliced into thick, dense slabs. It was chewy. It was sweet. It was weirdly satisfying. And for many, it was the closest thing to a roast they'd seen in months. Kids grew up associating that sharp ketchup aroma with comfort. It filled the house. It meant dinner was ready. And while some turned their noses up at the idea of cereal and meat, others called it genius. Today, recipes like this are buried in vintage church cookbooks and yellowing recipe cards passed down just in case. But every time someone opens a pantry and finds only ketchup, cornflakes, and a dream, this casserole's legacy lives on. If you've ever turned scraps into something sacred, this dish is yours too. So like, comment, and subscribe. The story isn't over yet. Imagine standing in a 1940s kitchen with no butter, no cream, no chocolate, and still needing to frost a birthday cake. That's how we got the Crisco and flour emergency frosting casserole. A bizarre, resourceful dessert filler that should never have worked, but somehow did. Crisco, that white, waxy, shelf-stable shortening, became the heart of this makeshift miracle. Originally created for industrial baking, it was cheaper than butter and didn't need refrigeration. In times of war and depression, Crisco meant dessert could still happen, even when the cupboard screamed empty. The frosting started by cooking white flour and water into a thick paste, whisked constantly until it looked like glue. That paste was cooled completely, then whipped with sugar, vanilla, and spoonfuls of Crisco until it fluffed up into something almost like buttercream. It had no dairy, no eggs, and no cocoa, yet women proudly layered on cakes, cupcakes, and yes, even baked into casseroles that resembled dessert bars. It was sweet. It was weird. It was survival dressed up in frosting. In casserole form, this mixture was spread over sponge cake layers or graham cracker crusts, sometimes topped with canned fruit or dusted with cinnamon to make it look more complete. It was humble, no doubt. But to a child in 1943, it was magic. Mothers knew it wasn't fancy, but it was soft, sweet, and generous. And when birthdays had no presents and rations were thin, a Crisco frosting casserole said, "We still celebrate. We still hope." Today, it's nearly forgotten, dismissed as poor food by modern standards. But it holds a quiet kind of brilliance, the power to turn nothing into a treat. Would you ever eat frosting made from flour and fat? Subscribe if this story surprised you, because what's next might shock you even more. There was a time when sandwich didn't mean meat, cheese, or even peanut butter. It meant 2 slices of white bread and a smear of ketchup. During the Great Depression, meat was a luxury, one that many families hadn't tasted in weeks, sometimes months. So mothers across America improvised, and the ketchup sandwich was born. It was cheap. It was fast. And most importantly, it was something. Some kids remember it fondly. Others say they cried the moment it hit the plate. Because to them, it was a reminder of what they didn't have. No ham, no cheese, not even mustard. just bread and red. In factory towns and farming communities, lunchboxes were filled with nothing more than this humble pairing. Sometimes, if the bread was stale, it would be toasted or pan-fried in lard, if there was any to spare. Others sprinkled sugar or pepper on top, trying to trick their tongues into thinking it was more than it was. But make no mistake, this wasn't about taste. It was about survival. It was about making sure your child didn't go to school hungry, even if their sandwich made them the target of teasing. And yet, in some strange way, it became a badge of honor. Because families who served ketchup sandwiches were the ones who refused to give up. They stretched every last dollar, made do with what they had, and kept pushing forward. Today, we laugh about it. Some even try recreating it on TikTok, like a quirky food hack. But back then, it wasn't quirky. It was heartbreaking. Still, it fed bellies. And sometimes, that's all that mattered. So the next time you bite into something simple, something plain, think of those kids. And the moms who turned a bottle of ketchup into dinner. Subscribe, because the meals we've forgotten tell the stories we can't afford to lose. They weren't planted. They weren't bought. But during America's leanest years, they were picked with pride. Dandelion greens, the humble weed most people curse today, were once a dinner table hero. In the dust-choked 1930s, when gardens failed and grocery store visits became rarer than rain, families turned to whatever grew, and dandelions grew everywhere. Backyards, alleyways, even along train tracks. If it had leaves, it was harvested. Mothers would wash them, boil them to tame the bitterness, and then layer them into casseroles with stale bread, bacon grease, or a few crumbles of cornmeal if they had it. Some added vinegar or canned tomatoes to bring brightness. Others thickened the dish with leftover mashed potatoes or flour paste. It wasn't pretty, but it filled the house with a smell that meant one thing. Dinner was coming. For many, this wasn't a quirky trend. It was a desperate act of nourishment. Dandelion greens were packed with iron, calcium, and vitamins, making them one of the only nutritious options available during the toughest years. Children grew up believing this weed casserole was just part of life. And in a way, it was. They didn't know it came from poverty. They just knew it came with love. By the 1950s, the recipe faded. People saw dandelions as a nuisance again. Lawn chemicals replaced backyard harvesting. Convenience trumpet tradition. But for those who remember, dandelion casserole isn't a joke. It's a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and survival. It proves that sometimes the best meals come not from what you buy, but from what you notice. So the next time you see a weed poking through the sidewalk, think twice. That little green leaf once saved supper. And if you believe forgotten recipes like this deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe. Because history lives in what we eat.